ramped up deportation enforcement has a high-profile case with Jorge Garcia, a man who brought into this country as a child, was deported on Martin Luther King Day. This, from the Detroit Free Press. Jorge Garcia was brought to the U.S. by an undocumented family member when he was 10 years old. Today, he has a wife and 2 children, all of whom are U.S. citizens. He's been trying for years to find a path to live legally in the U.S., with he and his wife spending $125,000 in legal costs and fees since 2005, says his wife. Garcia had been facing an order of removal from immigration courts since 2009, but under the previous administration, he had been given stays of removal. But because of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, Garcia was ordered in November to return to Mexico. His supporters say he has no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket, and pays his taxes every year. And we've had kind of a nasty history of backlash immigration policies and enforcement in our past. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the 1917 Act that mandated English-speaking literacy tests for immigrants, using a test requiring them to read 5 lines from the Constitution. Later, the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924 included policies like the National Origins Formula, which is restricting on the basis of representative population and national origin quotas to prevent ethnic shift. The Asian Exclusion Act, which is exactly what it sounds like, and other restrictions specifically on African, Arab, Italian, and Eastern European Jews. The officially stated rationale of those acts in the past was to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. I can't even say the word right. And each of these acts were reactions to essentially the waves of immigration that were instrumental in establishing the culture and influence. I'm getting interrupted by Alex Jones here. I can't shut him up.
If the cops showed up and said, come out, and they had the bullhorn, come out or we're going to fire tear gas, and you just go, ice cream cone.
Yeah. All right, I'll just throw Mr. Jones that way. So yeah, what I was basically getting at was these acts, these different immigration acts, were influential. There were reactions to waves of immigration that were influential or instrumental in developing and establishing culture and influence in America, in raising the population and making it this sort of thing that it's been celebrated for over the years, of being this giant dream, this place where you can make it. It really wasn't established that way by just having a handful of special white Puritans that tamed, the savages. There's this excuse also, kind of along those lines, that's made in the argument that we're supposedly a country of laws, that we seem to, in rhetoric at least, worship laws as an end-all. When someone says it's the law, sorry, there's supposed to be some kind of inherent moral imperative, and they're not really sorry. But why do laws exist in the first place? What are they supposed to do? What's their role in society? Since this is a social science podcast, I'd like to look at how maybe a classic sociologist like Max Weber looked at the function of laws in a broader societal system. So I'll just read a kind of a quote as a sort of a theoretical background. Rational adjudication on the basis of rigorously formal legal concepts is to be contrasted with a type of adjudication which is guided primarily by sacred traditions without finding therein a clear basis for the decision of concrete cases. So that's Weber stating that in very, very wonderfully convoluted verbiage that there are different forms of justice or legal decisions that are kind of that are brought on by institutional norms, by traditions, by social norms. So many systems are kind of based on sort of irrationality of development based on precedent and administered by a field of lawyers and jurists, so laws are kind of a representation of the history of the society, of the people that were in charge of developing these, and they're in response to the last person that made a law. They're in response to sort of what's going on at the time in society. They're not they're not handed down to Moses on 2 stone tablets with sort of these are now and forever the divinely inspired laws that are inherently good and should never be changed, and all of these are good. He kind of makes the case that or kind of describes the existence of laws as something that's inherently contextual, and something that is kind of built on by tradition and by flawed human thinking and just sort of flawed, very changing, sort of fluctuating societies. So, and then we have Emil Durkheim, who basically emphasized that the influence of history in changing the nature of the law and its application. So, kind of going a little bit on what was said before. So, there's society values that are brought on by sort of kind of the majority, with the that kind of reflect individual rights and responsibilities, but there's also a lot of variation in that. It's not very predictable. It's very infrequent, and so it's going to be changing constantly, and we see that. And this all seems pretty basic when you kind of look at it that way, but it's not basic, though, or at least it's not acted on like it's basic. It's something that we kind of in our discourse, in our dialogues, we hear that shouted out. It's the law. Well, laws are largely meant to be looked at, reviewed, and constantly edified as society, grows, learns, makes mistakes, sort of develops itself. And there's such a thing as a bad law. And I think the way that we have treated immigrants in the past, despite being a country that came into existence based on immigrants, came into existence under ideals, whether followed or not, of sort of equality of classes of people. At the same time, we might have laws or enforcement of laws that are very flawed, and I think we need to look at our value systems and question why they're there and whether they reflect, what our moral aspirations are. Do we desire to treat people equally? Do we desire everyone to have the same skin color? Do we desire to have diversity? These are questions that you need to at least be honest and upfront with, regardless of the side that you're on. So just a little kind of exercise and some honesty there as we try to think at sort of an elevated level as to how do we respond to some very very troubling, very sort of disturbing images we see of, families getting torn apart, of creating sort of like baby and kids rooms for these deportation facilities and these hearings. It's a great time for introspection into your own personal views of what makes a society just and moral, and what laws should be reconsidered and thought about, and why do you arrive at the immigration inclinations that you do?